My parents cut me out of their will. Not because I did anything wrong, but simply because I wasn't their biological child. But life has a way of balancing things out. An inheritance from a distant relative changed everything. Let me take you through my journey, starting from the beginning. The changes begin. Everything shifted when I was 14. At that time, I was just starting to find my footing in high school, dreaming of becoming a nurse someday. That's when my mother, Diana, decided to remarry. Her choice was Adrian Gardner, a successful CEO of a rising tech company. He came with baggage of his own, a 17-year-old son named Maxwell, already attending an elite private school. Let's just say Maxwell and I didn't exactly hit it off from the start. The tension was palpable even before the ink dried on their marriage certificate. What started as minor irritations quickly escalated into something more insidious. Maxwell would leave his dishes in the sink, somehow always when it was my turn to clean. Of course, I'd be the one getting lectured by either my mother or Adrian about maintaining a tidy kitchen. Or I'd notice my expensive shampoo disappearing faster than usual, only to see Maxwell's perfectly styled hair the next morning, reeking of my favorite product. Life at home. But it wasn't just Maxwell's behavior that bothered me. Adrian had his own way of making me feel like an outsider. As a high-achieving business executive, he had certain expectations about success and family image. Whenever something went wrong, his eyes would immediately turn to me, not his precious son. He wouldn't even bother asking questions. Just assume I was the problem. And my mother? Diana was too caught up in her new role as a marketing executive and the wife of a successful businessman to notice what was happening. She'd brush off my concerns, make excuses for Maxwell, and pretend everything was picture perfect for their social media posts. The double standards were impossible to ignore. About a year into this already strained living situation, Diana and Adrian announced they were expecting a child. That's when everything really changed. Suddenly, our entire household revolved around preparing for the new baby. They decided my room would make the perfect nursery. It had the best natural light, they said. I was relocated to a cramped guest room that barely fit my bed and desk. The message was clear. In this family's hierarchy, I was at the bottom. The new addition. A few months later, Oliver was born, and he immediately became the golden child. Maxwell, feeling the shift in attention, grew even more entitled. He dropped out of his prestigious college and moved back home, bringing with him an endless parade of equally privileged friends who treated our house like their personal party venue. Adrian dismissed my complaints about the noise and mess, while Diana would just give me that helpless look, as if to say, "What can we do?" He's going through a phase. The hypocrisy was suffocating. My late nights studying for nursing school were criticized, but Maxwell's all-night parties were somehow acceptable. I started spending more time at the hospital where I volunteered, finding solace in the structured environment of medical care. It was more than just escaping a toxic home situation. It was about finding my purpose, finding my path. The hospital became my sanctuary. I threw myself into volunteer work, joining every medical training program I could find, building my resume for nursing school. It wasn't just about avoiding home anymore. I discovered I had a genuine passion for healthcare. Still, home remained a place where I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells, waiting for the next criticism or accusation. One evening stands out in my memory. After a particularly long shift at the hospital, I came home exhausted but proud. I'd helped save someone's life during an emergency. The house was eerily quiet. A note on the refrigerator caught my eye. Family dinner at Giovanni's. They hadn't even bothered to text me. I stood there in my scrubs, still smelling of hospital antiseptic, staring at that hastily scribbled note. The message was crystal clear. I wasn't part of their family dinner plans. The breaking point. Shortly after my 18th birthday, everything reached a breaking point. By then, I was balancing my senior year with pre-nursing courses and a part-time job at a local clinic. Adrian constantly criticized my work schedule, claiming it would jeopardize my academic performance, though he never seemed concerned about Maxwell's complete lack of direction. Then came the night that changed everything. I returned home from a late shift to find my room in complete chaos. Maxwell had thrown another of his parties while Diana and Adrian were at a business function. My clinical notes were soaked in beer, my textbooks scattered across the floor, and my laptop, which I'd saved for months to buy, had a cracked screen. This wasn't just inconsideration. It was a complete violation of my space and my future. The confrontation. The next morning at breakfast, I finally stood my ground. I was still in my neat scrubs from my early morning hospital volunteer shift, while Maxwell lounged in designer pajamas, scrolling through his phone. "Your room wouldn't have been damaged if you'd been more responsible with your belongings," Adrian said coldly, barely looking up from his iPad, where he was probably checking his company's stock prices. Diana, dressed impeccably for her marketing firm meeting, just sighed and whispered something about families needing to work together and letting go of small issues. Small issues. My ruined medical textbooks and study materials were small issues to them. I'd had enough of letting things slide. Every move I made was scrutinized through a lens of suspicion, never concern for my well-being. Meanwhile, Maxwell, who had become a professional couch surfer, seemed to get away with everything. Even little Oliver, though just a toddler, was clearly being groomed as the family's crown prince. Academic struggles. I remember one particular incident that perfectly captured the daily struggle. I was working on a crucial nursing school prerequisite projects, an anatomy presentation that would determine my acceptance into the program. I tried to set up a study space in the corner of our living room, hoping to find some quiet. It felt like attempting brain surgery in the middle of Times Square. Maxwell would blast his music through his expensive sound system, a recent gift from Adrian to help with his creative pursuits. Oliver would run around screaming, which I understood. He was just a kid. But Adrian would only complain about how my medical textbooks and anatomical charts were cluttering up the space and bringing down the aesthetic of the room. This coming from the man who let Maxwell transform our garage into his personal studio for his never-materializing music career. Finding support. After packing up my study materials for the third time that week, I retreated to my friend Sarah's house. Her parents, both high school teachers, welcomed me into their quiet dining room. For the first time in what felt like ages, I could actually concentrate. That's when it hit me, how abnormal my home situation had become. "You know you're always welcome here, Evelyn," Sarah's mom said, bringing me a cup of coffee. "We love having a future nurse at our table." The simple kindness in her voice made my throat tight. A house wasn't supposed to be just a place you slept. It was supposed to be a home. Yet every hour I spent away from mine helped me breathe a little easier. Working towards independence. I started picking up extra shifts at the clinic, building my experience and my savings. Adrian, naturally, disapproved. He would often make snide comments about how my obsession with working would affect my grades, but I knew the real reason for his displeasure. I was becoming more independent, less under his control. As my savings grew, the idea of moving out started to take shape. It wouldn't be easy on a nursing student's salary, but it seemed like the only way to preserve my sanity and my dreams. The decision. My heart was pounding like a hospital monitor during a code blue the day I decided to tell them about moving out. I'd found a modest but affordable apartment near the hospital where I volunteered. The place was small, but it was within walking distance of the medical center, and I'd saved enough from my clinic work to cover the first 3 months' rent. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a place where I could study without criticism, where my medical books wouldn't be considered an eyesore. The announcement. One evening after dinner, I gathered my courage and asked Adrian and Diana to sit at the kitchen table. My hands were trembling slightly, but my voice remained steady. The same calm tone I'd learned to use with anxious patients during my clinical rotations. "I'm moving out," I said, meeting their eyes directly. The silence that followed was as heavy as a lead apron in radiology. Adrian's face shifted from surprise to that familiar look of condescension, while Diana's perfectly manicured fingers nervously tapped against her coffee cup. Adrian spoke first, his lips curving into that dismissive smile I'd grown to hate. "You think you're ready to live independently just because you work part-time at a clinic?" His voice dripped with the same disdain he used when discussing lower-tier businesses. Diana just sat there, staring at her designer coffee mug, her marketing executive persona momentarily cracking. "I am ready," I replied, my voice stronger than I felt. "I found an apartment near the hospital, and I've already saved enough for the deposit and first few months' rent. The battle begins." That's when the real argument started. I explained my need for a quiet study space and financial independence. Adrian launched into a tirade about my selfishness and ingratitude, his CEO mentality taking over as if this were a hostile corporate takeover. "Oliver looks up to you," he added, playing his favorite card. "What kind of example are you setting by abandoning your family?" As if watching Maxwell's perpetual unemployment was a better example. Diana's response was more subtle, but equally painful. She didn't argue like Adrian, but her words cut deep. "Families should stick together," she said, her marketing expertise showing in her careful word choice. "You'll regret leaving." But I knew better. This wasn't about family unity. It was about maintaining their perfect image. Standing firm. I held my ground. This wasn't just about wanting my own space. It was about my mental health, my future as a nurse, my very identity. I was tired of being the family scapegoat, exhausted from trying to fit into a household that had made it crystal clear I was an outsider. The next few days were a blur of packing and planning. Each textbook and scrub set I packed felt like a step toward freedom. On the morning of my move, Diana came into my room. I braced myself for another confrontation, but it never came. Instead, she helped me pack in silence, our conversation limited to practical matters like spare boxes and old kitchen utensils. We both avoided the elephant in the room, making small talk about weather and traffic patterns instead of addressing the real issues. The first night alone. Later that day, as I turned the key in my new apartment's lock, a whirlwind of emotions hit me like a rush of patience into the relief, grief, excitement, anxiety. They all competed for attention. I was finally on my own, my nursing textbooks neatly arranged on a small desk by the window. The apartment felt overwhelmingly empty and quiet. Despite everything, I found myself missing even the chaos of my old home. Maxwell's loud music, Oliver's running footsteps, even Adrian's constant criticisms. But as days turned into weeks, I began to appreciate the silence. For the first time since I was 14, I could breathe freely. No more tiptoeing around Adrian's mood swings or waiting to see if Maxwell had invaded my space again. I could study when I needed, sleep between hospital shifts without interruption, and slowly discover who I was beyond the family outcast. Finding my rhythm. Life quickly found its own rhythm. Between nursing school classes, clinical rotations, and maintaining my small apartment, I was busy but fulfilled. My relationship with Diana and Adrian improved slightly with distance. I kept our interactions brief but civil, which made them more manageable. The unexpected call. Then came the call that would change everything. Diana's voice on the phone was quieter than usual, almost hesitant. "Adrian's been reviewing his will," she said casually, as if discussing the weather forecast. He wants to make sure everything's properly arranged. I waited, my grip tightening on my phone, already knowing where this was heading. After a pause that felt as long as a night shift, she continued, "He's decided to include Maxwell and Oliver, but not you, since they're his biological children. He thinks it's more logical that way." The truth hurts. The words hit me like a crash cart to the chest. I hadn't expected much from Adrian, but hearing it stated so bluntly stung more than I'd anticipated. It wasn't about the money. I was building my own career in healthcare, but the message was clear. After all these years, I was still considered an outsider. "I understand, Mom," I managed to say, my voice as neutral as when delivering difficult news to patients' families. Diana, perhaps sensing my pain, quickly tried to soften the blow. "You know this is just legal paperwork, right? It doesn't change how we feel about you." But the damage was done. That night, lying in my bed, staring at my apartment ceiling, that familiar feeling of not belonging gnawed at me like a chronic wound. Part of me wanted to confront Adrian, demand an explanation, or simply tell him how deeply his decision hurt. But another part wondered what was the point. This family hadn't felt like mine for years. Why should this make any difference now? Creating distance. I decided to step back. I focused on my nursing career, threw myself into my clinical rotations, and spent more time building relationships with people who valued me for who I was, my fellow nurses, my patients, my instructors who recognized my dedication to healthcare. These were the people who mattered now. The pain from Adrian's will and years of feeling like an outsider began to fade, though it would occasionally flare up like a persistent symptom, especially during family events where I'd watch Maxwell and Oliver bask in the spotlight. Family dinner. A few months later, after Adrian recovered from a minor health scare, I was invited to a family celebration dinner. I went out of a sense of professional obligation, the same way I'd attend to a difficult patient. The evening was exactly as I'd expected. Adrian dominated the conversation with stories about his recovery and business successes, everyone fawned over Oliver's latest academic achievements, and Maxwell bragged about his newest business venture, another startup funded by Adrian's connections. I sat there in my scrubs, having come straight from a 12-hour shift, feeling more like an observer than a participant. A turning point. I made an excuse about an early morning shift and left after dinner. Driving back to my apartment in my reliable used car, bought with my own savings from night shifts, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. "I'm good," I told myself, using the same reassuring tone I used with nervous patients. Really good. I had processed the emotional trauma, faced the reality of my situation, and emerged stronger. For the first time in years, I felt at peace with who I was, a dedicated nurse, an independent woman, someone who had built her own life. The unexpected letter. But life had other plans. Just when I'd found my rhythm between hospital shifts and personal time, everything changed again. One afternoon, between patient rounds, I received a call from an unfamiliar lawyer. His voice was professional, but carried a hint of something I often heard in the hospital when delivering unexpected news. "Am I speaking with Evelyn Mitchell?" he asked. "Yes, that's me," I replied, stepping into an empty break room. "I'm calling about Eleanor Wright, your great-aunt," he explained carefully. "She passed away recently and named you as the sole beneficiary of her estate." Processing the news. I fell silent, my mind racing like it did during emergency room triage. Eleanor Wright. I barely remembered her. She was one of those distant relatives you'd hear mentioned in passing, someone who had helped raise my biological father. I hadn't seen her since I was a child, and now I was being told she'd left everything to me. "I'm sorry for your loss," the lawyer said, his voice breaking through my thoughts. She was quite a remarkable woman. Still trying to process this information, I managed a thank you. then expecting perhaps a small inheritance. Maybe some family photos or her old house, I asked. Exactly what did she leave behind? The inheritance. Your great aunt was quite successful, he explained. She made some excellent investments throughout her career in healthcare administration. The estate includes several properties, a significant investment portfolio, and a trust fund worth approximately $5 million. My heart nearly stopped, the kind of reaction I usually monitored patients for. I gripped my phone tighter, my mind struggling to comprehend the figure. Why me? We hadn't been close. I'd only visited her a few times as a child. The whole situation felt surreal. She left a letter for you, the lawyer continued. I'll send it along with the other documents. He mentioned that she explained her decision in detail. After we hung up, I sat in the break room, staring at my phone, trying to make sense of everything. Why had Aunt Eleanor chosen me? I barely knew her. Was this some kind of cosmic joke? Understanding the gift. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings with the lawyer, signing documents, and discovering exactly what I'd inherited. Beyond the money, there were properties, stocks, and personal items. But it was Eleanor's letter that touched me deeply. She wrote that she had always admired my independence and saw in me a reflection of herself when she was younger. She described me as determined, self-sufficient, and capable of building a life on my own, qualities she said she'd observed from afar through family connections. She wanted her wealth to go to someone who would use it meaningfully, someone who understood the value of hard work and perseverance. Reading her words in my apartment after a long hospital shift, I felt overwhelmed. Here was a relative I barely knew who had seen something in me that my own family had missed. She had recognized and valued my dedication to healthcare and my independence. Making changes. My first step was to purchase a small but comfortable home near the hospital where I worked. It wasn't extravagant. A 3-bedroom house with a dedicated study space for my medical journals and nursing research. Using my healthcare management experience, I also invested in a small medical office building as rental property and worked with a financial advisor to make sound investments with the remaining funds. Within a week, my life had transformed completely. No more worrying about rent between hospital shifts or calculating if I could afford both textbooks and groceries. For the first time, I felt truly secure and free. New challenges. However, this freedom brought its own complications. Initially, I kept the inheritance to myself, not telling anyone in the family. Given our history, I knew the news wouldn't be well received. I had no obligation to share this information. But secrets in the medical world rarely stay contained, and this one was no different. It started with a distant cousin who worked at the hospital and heard about the inheritance through professional circles. Diana found out before I could tell her, and the rest of the family followed like a cascade of medical complications. The call started almost immediately. Diana called first, her voice unusually warm and inquisitive, complimenting my career progress before casually mentioning how financially challenging things had been for her and Adrian. I recognized the symptoms of what was coming, just like spotting the early signs of a developing condition. The flood. The floodgates burst open. Adrian called next, then Maxwell, followed by relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Each suggested, in their own way, that they deserved a piece of my inheritance. Times are tough in the tech sector, they would say. Diana even played the health card. You know how expensive Adrian's medical care has been. They'd forgotten about me until I became a potential source of funding. I was overwhelmed with requests for money, loans, and investments in Maxwell's latest ventures. It felt like being swarmed by pharmaceutical reps, all wanting a piece of the action. Standing strong. I felt overwhelmed, the same way I did during my first Code Blue as a new nurse. For a brief moment, I questioned whether keeping the inheritance was selfish. But then I remembered all the years I'd spent feeling like an outsider, being blamed, dismissed, and ignored. I had worked endless night shifts to put myself through nursing school without their help. Now that I had stability, they wanted to claim it. When I was struggling through clinicals and living on coffee and ramen, none of them had offered assistance. The confrontation. When Diana finally asked why I hadn't told her about the inheritance sooner, I found the strength to reject her manipulation, using the same firm voice I used with non-compliant patients. I explained calmly but firmly that our estrangement was both emotional and physical. I had been pushed aside, ignored, and alienated for years, treated like an unwanted diagnosis rather than family. This inheritance allows me to continue my medical career and live independently, I told her, my voice steady. This is my life, and I need to manage it my way. I'm sorry if that upsets you, but I have to do what's best for my future. The fallout. The reaction was worse than a bad patient outcome. Diana accused me of being arrogant and inconsiderate. Adrian jumped in, lecturing me about family obligations with the same authority he used in board meetings. Still, I held my ground. Eventually, the calls became less frequent, and the demands for money stopped when they realized I wouldn't yield. It was difficult, but necessary, like setting a broken bone. I had learned a harsh truth about family. Sometimes the people closest to you can be the most toxic. Finding peace meant protecting myself from their influence. Finally, I decided to stop letting them diagnose my worth. Moving forward, this inheritance wasn't just about financial security. It was about taking control of my own path and living life on my terms. Communication with them became minimal, but I'd grown accustomed to it. I no longer needed their approval, and I had no obligation to provide them anything. I had my colleagues, my patients, and people who valued me for who I was, not what I could give them. An unexpected bridge. The surprise came from an unexpected source, Oliver. One day between shifts, I received a clumsy handwritten note from him. "I miss having a nurse in the family," he wrote in his teenage scrawl. "Sorry, everyone's being weird about money." Though small, this gesture meant something. Oliver, now 14, was reaching out in his own way. We started texting, simple conversations about his interest in biology, nothing too deep, but it was something. A small bridge being built. While I had no illusions about reconciling with the rest of the family, I was creating my own life, independent of their approval. The final meeting. For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. However, that sense of tranquility was short-lived. A few weeks after Oliver's letter, Diana contacted me again, wanting to discuss things. I could tell from my years of patient assessment that this wouldn't be a conversation about rebuilding bridges. I agreed to meet her at a public cafe, hoping to keep things professional. The atmosphere was tense from the start, like the moments before delivering difficult news to a patient's family. She barely asked about my nursing career or my life. Instead, she launched into a detailed account of their financial struggles since Adrian's health scare, Oliver's private school tuition costs, and Maxwell's latest failed startup. The ultimatum. I sat there listening, feeling like I was observing a case study in emotional manipulation. It became painfully clear why she'd requested this meeting. She mentioned house renovations and her need for a stress-relieving vacation. She wasn't here to heal our relationship. She was here with a specific prescription in mind. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Using my direct nursing approach, I said, "Mom, just get to the point." She looked me straight in the eye and said without hesitation, "I expect you to write me a check for $1 million. I nearly choked on my coffee. "Excuse me?" I asked, my professional composure momentarily slipping. She didn't flinch. "It's only fair. Since it came from your father's side of the family, all of that money should have been mine. The final break. I was stunned. Her sense of entitlement was as clear as a positive diagnosis. She sat there calmly demanding $1 million, as if ordering a routine prescription. "I'm not giving you $1 million," I said firmly, my voice as steady as when delivering critical care. Her expression shifted from entitled to openly hostile, like a patient refusing treatment. "You've always been ungrateful for everything we've done for you," she said, her words attempting to cast me as the villain for not surrendering the money she claimed she deserved. I paid for the coffee and left without looking back, my steps as purposeful as when responding to a code blue. Even after years of emergency room work, I was still amazed that my own mother would try to guilt me into giving her money she had no right to. The aftermath. What followed was worse than any hospital drama. Within days, Diana started spreading rumors through the family network. She told anyone who would listen that I had somehow stolen the inheritance, claiming it was rightfully hers, and accused me of hoarding it out of greed. Suddenly, relatives I hadn't seen since nursing school began calling, either supporting her claims or pressuring me to share the wealth. The hypocrisy was staggering, especially considering how Adrian had explicitly excluded me from his will because I wasn't real family. The legal threat. Even Adrian got involved, sending me a long, condescending text about family obligations and making inclusive financial decisions. I responded with one line. "You didn't include me in your will because I'm not family, remember?" That silenced him temporarily, but the drama wasn't over. Things escalated when I received an official-looking letter at the hospital. Diana was suing me. Yes, you read that correctly. My own mother was taking legal action, claiming that as my father's widow, she was entitled to a substantial portion of Eleanor's money. Initially, I panicked, imagining endless court battles while trying to maintain my nursing schedule. Professional support. I called my lawyer, who actually laughed after reading the letter. "This is as legitimate as a counterfeit prescription," he said, tossing it aside. He investigated the supposed attorney who'd sent the letter. The phone number was disconnected, and the office address was an abandoned building under renovation. It became clear that Diana and Adrian had hired a questionable, likely fraudulent lawyer in a desperate attempt to intimidate me into paying them. The recovery. While I was relieved the lawsuit was baseless, I felt deeply disappointed, like watching a patient choose a harmful path despite all warnings. Their willingness to go to such lengths for my inheritance was shocking. They had tried emotional manipulation, guilt-tripping, and now legal threats. I realized I needed to create some healthy boundaries, just as we do with high-risk patients. After the legal scare subsided, the emotional toll hit hard. I was exhausted, sleep-deprived, and the constant drama was affecting my work performance. That's when I realized I needed a break, the same advice I often gave to overwhelmed caregivers. The road trip. After discussing it with my colleagues from the emergency department, we decided to take a road trip together. Nothing extravagant, just visiting a few places we'd always talked about during our night shifts. It was exactly what I needed. Time away from the drama, a chance to clear my mind, and most importantly, space to think about my future in healthcare and beyond. Reflecting. As we drove between cities, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. A year ago, I was working double shifts just to afford my tiny apartment. Now I had financial security, my own home near the hospital, and the freedom to make decisions without interference. It was liberating, yet bittersweet. Growing up, I had looked to Diana and Adrian for guidance and support. To me, family meant having people who would stand by you during the tough times, like a medical team during a crisis. But I'd learned a difficult lesson. Sharing DNA or a household doesn't guarantee genuine support. Finding peace. Throughout the trip, I realized I didn't need their validation or approval anymore. I had everything I needed: my nursing career, my independence, and relationships with people who valued me for who I was, not what I could offer them. My hospital colleagues, friends, and even Oliver showed more genuine care than Diana or Adrian ever had. Closure. After returning to work, I decided to write letters to each family member who had tried to manipulate me. It was my form of discharge planning, not for them, but for my own closure. In those letters, I detailed how their actions had affected me, and how, despite my attempts to be part of the family, I was consistently treated like an unwanted diagnosis. I wished them well and hoped they would move forward, just as I had. A new beginning. The only response came from Oliver. Thanks for being honest. I still want to learn about medicine from you. Can we get lunch sometime? It wasn't much, but it was a start. Maybe Oliver and I could build something genuine, free from manipulation and expectations. As for the rest of the family, I accepted that we were better apart. Eleanor's inheritance had been more than a financial windfall. It was a revelation about true family. It wasn't the people who raised me. It was those who supported me when I had nothing to offer but myself. Looking back now, sitting in my office at the hospital between patient rounds, I have no regrets. I maintained my boundaries, secured my future, and found peace by letting go of toxic relationships. Life has a way of teaching us what truly matters, however painful those lessons might be. Surrounded by my medical team, who feel more like family than my actual relatives ever did, I know I'm exactly where I should be.